Hello dear students, welcome to Bajirao Ias Academy Interview Guidance Program 2023. In yesterday's class, we have discussed about Election Commission of India and the recent Supreme Court's verdict on the appointment and independence of the Election Commission of India. So if we can revise yesterday's class, the Supreme Court has given a verdict for the appointment of the Election Commission of India, Chief Election Commissioner of India. Okay, so the appointment usually done with a selection committee, where according to the Supreme Court, the members of the selection committee include Prime Minister, Leader of Opposition in the Lok Sabha, and also the Chief Justice of India. So after this judgment, Union government has passed another legislation. So this legislation particularly aimed to revise the judgment of the Supreme Court. Okay, so this particular legislation has provided for another committee with different members as given by the Supreme Court. Okay, so the members of the committee as per this particular legislation include the Prime Minister, Law Minister, and also the Leader of Opposition in the Lok Sabha. Right, so in this particular legislation, Chief Justice of India has not included in the selection committee, so therefore it has become controversial because there's a more influence of the executive, so that further impacts the independence of the Election Commission of India. So in this lecture, we are going to discuss about electoral reforms. So electoral reforms in India is a long pending and dynamic issue. So it is also an evolving issue where the parliamentarians and even the political executive very often reluctant to bring electoral reforms. So electoral reforms is very important topic for UPSC mains as well as your interview preparation, right? So in this context, so what does the electoral reforms actually mean, and what are the earlier reforms in elections, in conducting elections, and what reforms required and what reforms are being suggested by the Election Commission of India in this regard? So we will understand in this lecture. So firstly, understand, so what is electoral reforms? Okay, so electoral reforms usually refers to changes or improvements in the electoral process or elections, right? So this electoral reforms, the overall objective of the electoral reforms is to make sure the elections are conducted in a free and fair manner. There is a level playing field for every political party and every candidate who is contesting elections, and also strengthening the democracy, right? So the electoral reforms, apart from the above mentioned objectives, will also ensure integrity and transparency in the overall electoral system, right? So integrity and transparency in the electoral system will further strengthen democracy without a doubt. So because of these reasons, the electoral reforms are necessary to maintain the credibility of the electoral process and ensure that every one vote counts. Okay, so in democracy, so for particularly Indian democracy, we have universal adult franchise. So according to universal adult franchise, every citizen who is above 18 years of age is eligible to vote. Okay, so because of this reason, every one vote counts in democracy, particularly a functional democracy like India. So therefore, it is utmost important for us to maintain the credibility of the electoral system and the voting process. So because of this reason, electoral reforms are very important and significant. So in this context, we first understand what is the significance of electoral reforms. So why we need electoral reforms? So electoral reforms actually ensure free and fair elections in a democracy like India, right? So they ensure free and fair elections. In fact, this provision of free and fair elections has been envisioned by the Indian Constitution through Article 324 of the Indian Constitution. Because these electoral reforms, they aim to address specific issues. For example, electoral malpractices. So what are those electoral malpractices? For example, booth capturing and liquor, money, muzzle power in elections. So all those things are considered as electoral malpractices. So the electoral reforms will specifically address those electoral malpractices, and they also ensure that the elections are conducted in a free and fair manner that provides a level playing field for the every candidate who contests elections. And apart from that, it will enhance the voters' participation. So as I have already told you, in India, every citizen who is above 18 years of age is eligible to vote. So that is universal adult franchise. So however, in democracy, in order to make democracy work, every voter should cast his or her vote. So therefore, in this context, in order to enhance the voter participation, in order to increase the participation of voters in the electoral process, the electoral reforms are very important, because they aim at increasing the overall voter turnout and to address the issue of voter apathy and difficult in accessing the polling booths. For example, there are few remote corners, northeast and Himalayan states, Western Ghats. So they are remote corners. So generally apathy will prevail among the voters in those remote areas. So however, a better functioning of the election commission and electoral reforms will ensure greater participation of those citizens in the electoral process. Okay, so that is the essence of democracy in India. Now after that, the electoral reforms will help in reducing the influence of money and muscle power, right? So in today's electoral process, in today's elections, money power and muscle power are one of the most challenging issues, so that have been impacting the overall electoral process. And because of this reason, the political parties very often preferring candidates with a lot of financial power, with a lot of financial background or a criminal background. So therefore, money and muscle power has been playing a crucial role in today's elections. So however, electoral reforms will help in reducing the influence of money and muscle power by regulating the campaign finance and ensuring the safety of voters. So because of this reason, electoral reforms are very important. Now what electoral reforms will do with respect to money and muscle powers? So the election expenditure will be there will be limits on election expenditure by the election commission if there are electoral reforms. And if there are electoral reforms which particularly aimed at preventing criminalization of politics, then those electors, so those people who contest elections who are already convicted of a crime more than 2 years will not be eligible to contest elections. So these are the necessary electoral reforms that has to be brought in order to prevent the criminalization of politics or criminals making laws or entering politics. Now after that, the electoral reforms will encourage transparency and accountability in the electoral system, right? So for example, what does it mean when we say that encouraging transparency and accountability in the electoral process? So it encourages mandatory disclosure of criminal records by the candidates and the use of technology to monitor the electoral process. Now we have been using technology like electoral voting machines, VVPAT, voter verifiable paper audit trail. So therefore, more and more use of technology convincing the voters will bring in transparency and accountability in the electoral process, and that is the essence of free and fair election process. And apart from that, it will also help in addressing the electoral inequalities. So if there are any electoral inequalities, then the electoral reforms will help in reducing the electoral inequalities, so thereby providing a level playing field for every political party, every candidate. And there are certain sections who are underrepresented, who lack representation in the Lok Sabha or in the state legislative assembly and even at the local levels. So therefore, it provides an opportunity for the underrepresented communities to provide representation, greater representation. and prevent marginalization of those communities. Okay, so this is the actual necessity of electoral reforms because of all these reasons that we have mentioned here. So because of all these reasons we require electoral reforms. Now we look into the other dimension of this topic, that what are the electoral reforms that already brought in by the government. Okay, so before 1996, so there were a set of reforms that were already implemented. Okay, so electoral reforms that were already implemented before 1996. Now the first electoral reform that was introduced was increase in the number of proposers. So this is particularly with respect to contesting elections to Rajya Sabha and contesting elections to the Legislative Council, right? So both for the Rajya Sabha and the Legislative Council, the elections are conducted in an indirect manner, right? So we all know that the elections are conducted in an indirect manner. So you elect the MLAs, member of legislative assemblies, and in turn those member of legislative assembly will elect the members of a legislative council if a state has a legislative council. And similarly, those member of legislative assemblies will also elect the Rajya Sabha members. So as part of this reform, in the year 1988, the number of proposers in nomination papers for elections to Rajya Sabha and State Legislative Council were actually increased to 10% of the electors of the constituency, or 10 such electors. So whichever is less. So who are the electors in this case? The electors are members of legislative assemblies. So they are considered as electors, right? So whichever is less, so they have to propose the individuals who are ready to contest for the elections of Rajya Sabha or Legislative Council. Okay, so therefore preventing everyone to contest elections to Rajya Sabha or state legislative councils, so thereby reducing the expenditure of the election commission. And secondly, the second most important reform is lowering the voting age of the individuals. So in the introduction of this lecture, I have already told you that we have adopted the system of universal adult franchise. So after the implementation of the constitution, first few general elections, we have 21 years as age limit for providing or giving voting rights. So however, through the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act of 1988, so it has reduced the voting age from 21 years to just 18 years for Lok Sabha and State Legislative Assembly elections. So this is one of the most important and most crucial electoral reform. So that has envisioned providing an opportunity for more and more population to be part of the electoral process. Okay, so please remember the 61st Constitutional Amendment Act 1988. So after that, the other major important political reform is with respect to booth capturing. Now what does it mean when we say booth capturing? So booth capturing is taking control of the electoral booth. Okay, so elections are conducted at a booth level. So if someone has taken control of a booth, then it is considered as a booth capturing. So however, in 1989, so there was a provision that was made for the adjournment of polls or cancellation of the polls. So if there were any instances of booth capturing, because generally what happens with the money and muscle power, few individuals very often control the booth and they manipulate the votes. So therefore this is also another major important electoral reform that was brought in the year 1989. Now after that, we need to talk about the electoral voting machines as well. So the electoral voting machines were also introduced, right? So the electoral voting machines will accurately record the votes of every individual, and it also makes the voting process further simple, right? And it also prevents attempts like booth capturing and rigging, manipulating votes by the ruling political parties or the local parties. So the first time use of EVMs were actually occurred in general elections that were happened in Kerala May 1982. Okay, so first time the EVMs were used in 1982 general elections in Kerala. So in 2004 general election Lok Sabha, the EVMs were used in all 543 parliamentary constituencies. So however, please understand, first time EVMs were used in Kerala polls in the year 1982. So however, in the year 2004 general elections, EVMs were used across all 543 constituencies. Okay, so these were the reforms that were brought before 1996. Now after that, we need to understand the electoral reforms which were brought after 1996. So what were the major electoral reforms that were brought after 1996? Now when it comes to the presidential and vice presidential elections, so they also take place in an indirect manner. Okay, so indirect elections takes place for the election of president and vice president. Now if you look at the presidential elections, so generally presidents are elected by the elected members of Lok Sabha, state legislative assembly, as well as the Rajya Sabha, except members who are nominated by the president. So vice presidential elections also takes place in a similar fashion. So however, when we talk about the electoral reforms of president and vice president, in 1997, the number of electors as proposers and seconders for contesting election to the office of the president was increased from 10 to 50. And to the office of the vice president, the number of proposers were increased from 5 to 20, similar to the electors or similar to the elections to Rajya Sabha as well as state legislative councils. Okay, so this is the first electoral reform that has been brought after 1996. Similar to this, there was also a declaration of criminal antecedents assets by the candidates. Now in Indian politics, there's a trend. The trend is criminals have been entering into the Indian politics, and that has led to the criminalization of politics. Okay, so that has led to the criminalization of politics. So therefore, the declaration of criminal antecedents, assets, etc. by the candidates. So in 2003, Election Commission issued an order. So according to this order, the Election Commission of India has directed every candidate to disclose the information on the matters of conviction, accusation, assets, or any other liabilities. So therefore, every candidate who is contesting elections mandatorily provide the details with respect to the conviction, details of conviction, accusation, assets and liabilities, so that it helps in understanding or it helps in evaluating the criminal antecedents of the candidates who are contesting elections. So the next major electoral reform is free supply of electoral rolls by the Election Commission of India. So there are certain parties who are recognized and registered political parties. So recognized political parties are those parties which have a certain share of voting, right? So since they have a certain share of voting, and those parties are called as recognized political parties, and Election Commission will provide, will supply free of cost copies of the electoral rolls and other prescribed material to the candidates from recognized political parties of Lok Sabha as well as the state legislative assembly. Okay, so apart from that, there were certain parties which are entitled to accept the contributions. Okay, the political parties usually run based on the political donations, right, of funding. So in 2003, political parties had to report any contribution which is excess of 20,000 to the Election Commission for making any claim or any income tax relief, right? So this is also another major reform, because black money very often rooted into the accounts of the political parties. So therefore, it helps in assessing the funding patterns of the political parties, which are also part of the Indian democracy. So these were a set of major electoral reforms after 1996. So then we need to understand the electoral reforms since 2010. So what are the major electoral reforms since 2010? So firstly, so there were certain restrictions which have been imposed on the exit polls. Now exit polls are generally considered as polls which has uh, which assesses the voter sentiment, right? So which assesses the voter sentiment. So according to a 2009 provision, conducting exit polls, publishing results of exit polls would be prohibited during the election to Lok Sabha and state legislative assemblies. Okay, so the Election Commission of India has also imposed strict restrictions on announcing the results of exit polls. So since they have the chance of manipulating voters by different political parties, and since that is against conducting free and fair elections in a democracy like ours. And after that, there's a certain time limit for submitting a case of disqualification. Okay, now in 2009, a 3-month time limit was added within which the specified authority will have to submit the case of a person found guilty of corrupt practice to the president to determine the question of disqualification. Now how a member is being disqualified, right? So we need to understand a member is being disqualified by the president on the recommendations of the Election Commission of India. So however, in 2009, a 3-month time limit was provided for a member. Okay, so within which the specified authority will have to submit a case of a person found guilty of corrupt practice. Okay, so a 3-month time period has been provided, and after that, the Election Commission of India has also increased the security deposit for contesting elections. Now, when the Election Commission has increased the security deposit, it will prevent contesting more candidates. Okay, so who are not serious. So they are not serious, but they're just contesting elections. Okay, so in 2009, the amount of security deposit to be paid by the candidates contesting elections to the Lok Sabha was increased from 10,000 to 25,000. So thereby reducing the false contestants. And after that, there's an appellate authority within the district which has been created. If you have any complaints with respect to the election which has been done, so you can approach the district appellate authority. So this was also brought in the year 2009. So a provision was made for the appointment of an affiliate authority within the district against orders of the electoral registration officers instead of the chief electoral officers of the state. So you don't need to approach this chief electoral officer of the state. Instead, an appellate authority has been created at the district level, and this was also brought in the year 2009. Okay, so apart from those reforms, there were also a set of reforms. For example, there was a Lily Thomas case by the Supreme Court. Okay, so according to the Lily Thomas case, what Supreme Court has held, that there will be an immediate disqualification of convicted MPs and MLAs. Okay, so this was the Supreme Court's judgment with respect to the electoral reforms, particularly a prevention of criminalization of politics or criminals entering into the political system. Okay, so those MPs or MLAs who are convicted, will immediately disqualified from holding membership of the House. So there will be no time period of 3 months for any appeal. Okay, so earlier we have talked about the members were given 3 months of time period, but in Lily Thomas case, the Supreme Court has directly said that there will be no time period of 3 months. So they will be immediately disqualified after their conviction. And apart from that, the cap on corporate contributions also lifted. So this means that the corporate companies can contribute indefinite amount of money as political donations or political funding to the political parties. So in 2017 budget, the limit on the corporate contributions from 7.5% of the net profit of a company's past 3 financial years has been removed. So earlier provision was there's a certain limit on a certain extent to which the corporate company can contribute to the political funding. Now this 7.5% limit has also lifted, so corporate companies can contribute as much money as possible to the political parties. So therefore this cannot be considered as an electoral reform. Rather, there's a greater chance of these corporate companies influencing the policies, the political system and the political parties. Okay, so there's always a debate between the corporates and inclusive development, economic growth and environmental sustainability. So therefore lifting a cap of political funding is something which may not be considered as a electoral reform. So after that, the election commission has also introduced the electoral bonds. No, not electoral election commission of India. In fact, the election commission of India has raised objections with respect to the electoral bonds. Rather, in the year 2018 the government has introduced electoral bonds. Okay, so if you want to donate money to the political parties, you have to purchase these electoral bonds. So it is actually considered as an alternative to the cash donations made to the political parties. So according to the government, it also aimed at creating or bringing clean money and substantial transparency into the system of political funding. So however, the electoral bond scheme also has its shortcomings, also has its loopholes to bring in black money into the political parties, or converting black money into the white money. Okay, so after that, earlier foreign funding was not allowed into the political parties kitty, but now the foreign funds by the political parties are now allowed to accept the foreign funds. The government has amended the Foreign Contribution Regulation Act 2010. So these three provisions are something which are contested, controversial. So because instead of bringing electoral reforms, these three provisions have made that the political parties receive funds from the corporate groups, corporate companies, and there's no transparency and accountability in the political funding. So that has substantial threats for the democracy, because there's a chance that the government policy might be influenced by the corporate companies. Okay, so government biased functioning, government's biased functioning in favor of these corporate groups, that could be a detrimental factor in a democracy like India. Particularly, we are looking to ensure the inclusive growth. Okay, so there were certain committees which have recommended the electoral reforms. Okay, for example, the Takunde committee that was appointed in the year 1974, and Dinesh Goswami committee, Vora committee, Venkat Challaya National Commission, Law Commission, Indrajit Gupta committee, Election Commission of India report, so Veerappa Moily commission and Tanka committee. So these were all the most important committees to remember. So please remember at least one or two reforms suggested by these committees. For example, when we talk about the Dinesh Goswami committee, this committee has recommended the state funding of elections. Okay, and Venkat Challaya commission has also recommended the partial state funding of elections. So I would like to suggest you please remember at least two suggestions of each of these commissions, and that will definitely helpful for you in your mains examination as well as in your interview preparation, so that you can answer any question on this in a confident manner. So in this context, what are the reforms which were recommended by the Election Commission of India? We need to understand this aspect also in a very brief manner. Okay, so the first reform that was suggested by the Election Commission is that law should be amended to provide that a person cannot contest from more than one constituency at a time. Now the rule is one individual can contest from two constituencies. Okay, so we can mention the example of Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Okay, so one individual can contest from two constituencies. So but the problem with this is that if a candidate wins both the constituencies, then the election commission has to conduct the by-election. Okay, so conducting by-election is not an easy process. So because of this reason, the Election Commission of India has been suggesting that one individual should contest from only one constituency. So after that, the Election Commission has also endorsed the call for a lifetime ban in the apex court. Okay, so it has endorsed a call for lifetime ban in the apex court. For example, if a candidate who is convicted of more than 2 years, he should be banned for life. He should not be allowed to contest elections, and that is one factor that helps deterring the individuals or deterring criminals entering the politics, and it will also reduce or prevent criminalization of politics. So that is very important at this point of time. And apart from that, the Election Commission of India has also proposes an amendment to provide the same protection and safeguard with respect to the removability of the election commissioners. Now, this has been discussed earlier in previous lecture, that how the election commissioners are being removed and how the chief election commissioner is being removed. So the chief election commissioner is being removed on the same grounds as the judge of the Supreme Court. However, this protection has not extended to the other two election commissioners. So however, the election commission has been recommending that the removal process should also be extended to the other election commissioners. Okay, so right, apart from that, the decisions relating to the anti-defection matters should be considered by the president or governor with the recommendations of the election commission. So this is also a most important reform, since speakers are very often not playing an impartial and non-partisan role. The election commission has recommended that the decision with respect to the anti-defection law should be taken by the president with respect to Lok Sabha and governor with respect to the state legislative assembly, based on the recommendations of the Election Commission of India. And this is also a most important electoral reform. So you just remember these 4 electoral reforms. So that is enough. Okay, so however, you have to keep in mind at least 2 reforms of earlier mentioned committees, so that will be definitely helpful for you. So that's all about the electoral reforms and the necessity of electoral reforms and the electoral reforms that were already brought in with this Election Commission of India, and what are the electoral reforms that have to be brought in. Okay, so that's all for this lecture. So please subscribe to our YouTube channel and also hit the bell icon and like our video. Thank you.